Ever seen an Eljer Canterbury before? Well, here's the 1.6 gallon version. The Eljer Canterbury has had a very interesting history. Originally, back in the 3.5 days, it used to be a one-piece model and a two-piece model as well. However, around the 90s, the one-piece model became more prevalent. In the 90s, a 1.6 gallon version was made, and then later in the 2000s, it was redesigned as the Canterbury HP, which is another one piece, but it's a bit different compared to this, or its 3.5 counterpart. Not much is known about the 3.5 version, but if I had to assume, it was probably a Lowbow, but this one is not a Lowbow. It wants to be a Lowbow, but it's not. The 1.6 gallon version, Eljer Canterbury from the 90s, is definitely one of the most unique toilets I've ever seen, for better or for worse, and we're about to see what it's like. Starting off with the overall design, it's not much to write home about. It's basically like any one-piece toilet. There's the Eljer logo slapped on near the tank, and you got one on the bowl. Tank lid right there. Let's come around to the side, and this is what the side looks like. You can tell the trapway passages are not the best design. It's basically similar to a front flusher design, almost similar to, let's say, the America's General Cadet 2, which was a front flusher which had the same exact trapway passage as shown here. As we move inside the tank, you can definitely tell, like many one-piece toilets, it's a bit compact, which means finding replacement parts for this can be very hard, and retrofitting them in with other parts can be a bit of a pain sometimes. There's the handle, which also was used on the emblem model starting with the second generation in the early 80s, and it's basically incorporated into this as well. The original fill valve, it works, but you can definitely tell it has seen better days. It's actually kind of slowly leaking into the bowl, even though it's already filled up. It's a bit weird. The base is a bit small. The flapper is still original, but does not really stay open that much. And there's the ball cock attached to the fill valve. Yeah, of course the flapper does not stay open, so you gotta hold down the handle with the original parts. And that's them functioning. Now we'll move inside the bowl itself. It's a bit deeper than most Eljer toilets from this time, but if it was a comfort eye toilet, it would be pretty deep as this. So it's interesting to see on a standard high toilet how deep the bowl is for these. But up here, the rim is a bit dirty, but that's because it's been abandoned. The rim jets are angled so it swirls. Clean the back. The back rim has the hardest time getting rinsed, but minus the fact that it does come down. It does struggle for rinse sometimes, but it's not as bad as some other toilets. There's the trapway opening. There's some stainage there. I don't know what that is, but it's from sitting around. But it's just a circular opening. Now we're going to see the flush. And it's very interesting. And that was what the handle held down. The siphon isn't the greatest, but the flush itself is very interesting. It fills up to almost the top, like it's about to overflow, which might not please some people, but then it just kind of sinks back down and siphons out. Definitely Lowboy-esque kind of flush, but without being a Lowboy. It's definitely a very interesting flush overall, for better or for worse. What's interesting about this is that the front rim jets are pretty large, as you'll see here. You can just see how large they are. It almost looks like a front flush almost, but a bit different. Very strange. And that is the Eljer Canterbury, the 1.6 gallon version that is. This version of the Canterbury is definitely one of the strangest One Pieces I've ever seen. It acts like a Lowbow, but it's not really a Lowbow technically. It's definitely a very interesting design, for better or for worse, and now it's time to grade it. Before we start grading this toilet, we're going to go ahead and get rid of one category and replace it with a new one. We are getting rid of the modability category because it's kind of pointless considering the tank parts category, as we can incorporate both the tank parts and the modability into both categories. In return though, we're going to add a new category, quality control. This is about the same as I've done it before, however I'm going to incorporate a lot of factors into it, like how common defects are, if everything works properly, basically kind of incorporating each category into this one grading part. So we'll see how it works. And since I don't want to leave them hanging, let's go back to the previous 3 toilets that I have not given this grade to and replace the modability with the new quality control category. Starting off with the 2000's 3rd generation Mansfield Alto, the score on quality control would be a 4, and that would actually increase its grade up to a 35 out of 100. On the 1st generation Aquasource Sechmore toilet, it would be a 2, which means the grade will stay the same as before. And as for the Mansfield Summit, it would actually get a score decrease, as the quality control would be ranked as 6. Therefore, the lower end score would actually be a 32 out of 100, and the higher potential score would be a 63 out of 100. Now that that's over, we can grade a 1.6 Eljer Canterbury from the 1990s to the 2000s. Starting off of the overall design, it looks fairly basic. While it doesn't look bad per se, if you've seen a one-piece toilet, you've basically seen them all, and this is no different. Therefore, it scores a 5. As for the tank parts in this toilet, they are serviceable, but definitely not the greatest. Thankfully, they can be easily replaced, but not so much so considering this is a one-piece toilet. And as with one-piece toilets, they have smaller tanks. While you can definitely find something to suffice and replace parts with if needed, it's a bit harder considering the limited space, which means you probably are limited on options when replacing. While it's definitely not as bad as some Lowbow toilets, which actually need particular parts and are very expensive to sort out, you can find some reasonable retrofits, but definitely a little bit more limiting on that factor though. Therefore, it scores a 5. As for the quality control of this toilet, it actually seems perfectly fine. Like, everything functions as normal, there's very little defects or problems in terms of the overall design of the toilet, and it seems to work perfectly well. However, it is a little bit lacking in the siphonic part. While it definitely does siphon, it's definitely a lot more shorter, and this will kind of impact the score as well. Overall though, it's definitely not as bad as some other toilets, and it's definitely more consistent. Considering around the time the 1.6 gallon movement was getting started, a lot of the quality kind of went downhill, and especially when the scam that is known as the 1.28 gallon movement was started, it got even worse. So it could definitely be a lot worse. Overall, it scores a 7. The trackway is not terrible, but it's not great either. The passages themselves are a little bit more restrictive, and the trackway opening is a little bit small. The overall size is 1 3/4 inches, and therefore it could probably lead to a little bit more clogs here and there, and for that it scores a 4. The flush is very interesting. It fills up the entire bowl, and then it goes straight down and siphons out. That's more of a Lowbow-esque flush, but it's definitely a little bit more interesting looking. However, the siphon is definitely the lacking part of it, though overall it scores a 6 in flush. The pull and siphon are probably the worst part of this toilet. While the pull is kind of there, the siphon is pretty crappy and very short. Even if you hold down the handle, it also doesn't seem very powerful that much, and that can often lead to some problems every now and then, especially with getting rid of stuff in the bowl. While it's not as terrible as you might think it is, it definitely impacts it pretty greatly, and it scores a 3. Performance is okay. Definitely not the greatest, but also not the worst. With a smaller trapway, it probably would mean that you would clog it that much more, but I've honestly been surprised by this toilet, as this thing has only clogged once in its entire lifespan. That's kind of impressive, although I've heard the performances on the round ball versions are a lot more worse, but overall I'd score it a 5. The ball run seems perfectly fine on it, however the background definitely can have some stains left over every now and then. That's because of how deep the bowl is, and even though the flush gets it more towards the top, it still kind of struggles every now and then, although it's definitely a lot better than you might be thinking, and overall scores 6. The survivability of this toilet is kind of mid-range. While it's not terrible, it's definitely not perfect, and I think a score of 5 would be perfectly fitting for this. As for the overall value, it's definitely not perfect. It's not terrible, but definitely not perfect. From the weird flush that might scare some people, to the restricted trapway that causes the siphon to be pretty pathetic, to the overall smaller trapway design in general, you ain't really going to get much out of this toilet besides a nice looking one piece, and that's about it. The flush is definitely interesting and the ball runs definitely isn't bad, but everything else is pretty middle of the road, which definitely could turn some people away from this toilet. It's not terrible, but it definitely isn't great, and it probably won't age great either. Overall, it scores a 4. And the final score of the Eljer Canterbury from the 1990s to 2000s 1.6 gallon version is a 50 out of 100. Right in the middle. This toilet is definitely one of the strangest one pieces I've ever seen. From the Lowboy-esque flush to the overall design of it, it's definitely interesting, however, it won't age the greatest overall. If the trapway was definitely redesigned to be a little bit more siphonic, and the flush was kind of altered so it won't be so scary, I definitely think this could have been an interesting toilet to have. But in terms of everything, it just ends up being a pretty meh toilet.